Thank you. You may be seated. Mr. Noble, you're still under oath, and Mr. Robles, you may proceed.
As you know, both the Irvine Police Department and the Albuquerque Police Department provide crime statistics to the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Yes.
And as you know, that these statistics compiled by the FBI create, or I should say, are compiled as the FBI's uniform crime reports.
Yes.
Now, based on those uniform crime reports, is it true that the city of Irvine, with a population of over 1,000, was the lowest, had the lowest crime rate of any city in the country?
Well, I think you misstated your question. You said with a population of 1,000.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The population rates for the crime statistics are divided into categories for cities with a population of above 100,000 is one category, if that's what you were referring to.
So, for cities above 100,000, is it fair to say that the city of Irvine has the lowest crime rate in the country?
Really depends on which year, but yes, there have been years where it was recognized as one of the safest cities in the nation.
Now, isn't it true that Irvine has had the title of the lowest violent crime rate in the country for 11 years in a row?
Well, the last 4 years I have no idea. Since I retired, I haven't really been following that. Prior to that, I know that there were certainly years where we were in the top 10, but not always the #1 city.
Okay. Now, do you agree that the city of Irvine is a safe place to live?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely.
Okay. Now, because Irvine is such a peaceful city, you would agree with me that it's no surprise that there were no murders or non-negligent manslaughters in the city of Irvine during 2014?
Again, I wasn't working there in 2014, so I don't know.
Okay, but you lived in the city of Irvine, right?
No, I don't.
Okay. Now, do you know how many murders were committed in the city of Albuquerque in 2014?
No, I don't.
I'd like to turn your attention to this particular case in the documents you reviewed. Is it fair to say that there are 21 audio and video recordings of this case, in this case?
I don't know how many audio and video recordings there are.
Did you review all 21 audio, or did you review all the audio and video recordings in this case?
No, I did not.
Why did you choose to ignore certain audios and videos and review others?
The videos and audios that I was concerned with were those audios and videos that were focused around the time of the shooting.
Okay. So you didn't pay particular attention to all the sequence of events that led up to the shooting, is that true?
No, the sequence of events was documented in the investigatory report.
But you chose not to review the source of the investigatory reports, that is, the videos and audios that recorded the events that happened during this incident.
I accepted that information to be accurate, that regarding the number of threats and the things that had happened. I accepted those to be accurate.
Based on your review and the investigation of this case, would you agree with this statement that open space officers Hernandez and Officer McDaniel ordered Mr. Boyd to drop his knives approximately 25 times?
I don't know how many times they ordered him to do it. I know they ordered him to do it. I know he was ordered over the course of many, many times to drop his knife.
Now, does the number 25 times, does that seem a fair and accurate representation of how many times Officer Hernandez and McDaniel actually ordered Mr. Boyd to drop the knives?
Again, I don't know the precise number. I know it was many times. If 25 is the number, I'm not surprised by that at all.
Okay. You would agree with me that the patrol officers who negotiated with Mr. Boyd asked him to drop the knives approximately 3 times. Is that right?
I don't know. I didn't count.
Isn't it true, based on your review of Officer Weimer-Skirch's video, that he asked Mr. Boyd to drop his knives 5 times?
Again, I didn't count. I was certainly asked numerous times to drop the knives.
Okay. And based on your review of the investigation, is it fair to say that Mr. Boyd was asked approximately 33 times to drop the knives?
Again, I didn't count them up. I don't know what the exact number is.
Does 33, based on your review of the evidence in this case, does that seem like a fair and accurate number?
There was a large number of times. I'm not surprised by that number. It doesn't surprise me at all.
And you would agree that each and every time the officers asked Mr. Boyd to drop his knives, he did not.
That's true.
Now, during your review of the videos, you saw that officers told Mr. Boyd to keep his hands out of his pockets. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And based on your experience and training, would you agree with me that asking a suspect to keep their hands out of their pockets is a proper police technique?
Yes, it is.
And the reason why police officers ask suspects not to put their hands in their pockets is that that's where a suspect may have weapons.
Yes.
So you've done that in the past. Is that fair to say?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And if another officer did the same, you would agree that that's a reasonable measure for an officer to protect his or her safety?
Yes.
Now, based on your review of the investigation in this case, did you know that the patrol officers who negotiated with Mr. Boyd asked him to keep his hands out of his pockets 11 times?
Didn't count them up. I know they asked numerous times, yes.
Does 11 seem like a fair and accurate number based on your review of the investigation?
I certainly don't dispute that.
Okay. And you would agree with me that each and every time Mr. Boyd was asked to keep his hands out of his pockets, Mr. Boyd refused to do so?
I'd have to go back and look at the tapes. I don't know whether he would take his hands out of his pockets. His hands weren't in his pockets all the time, but there were certainly, he was given that direction many times, and he was non-compliant.
You would agree with me that in your review of the investigation of this case, you learned that Mr. Boyd threatened to kill law enforcement officers?
Threatened to kill who?
Law enforcement officers.
Yes.
Okay. And you would agree with me that Mr. Boyd used the word kill?
Yes.
Mr. Boyd threatened to kill Officer Hernandez and Officer McDaniel approximately 3 times.
Don't remember the number. Yes, he threatened to kill him.
Does it 3 seem like, based on your review of the information in this case, that seem about right to you?
I don't dispute that number.
Okay. You would agree with me that Mr. Boyd threatened to kill the officers who were negotiating with him once?
He made threats during the course of the event many times about threatening to kill officers.
Now, you would agree with me, based on your review of Officer Weimer-Skirch's video, that Mr. Boyd threatened to kill him 15 times?
I don't know the numbers. Many times, yes.
Okay. Based on your review of Officer Weimer-Skirch's video, you would agree with me that 15 is a fair approximation of the number of times Mr. Boyd threatened to kill Officer Weimer-Skirch?
That seems about right.
Okay. So, based on your view of the entire case file in this matter, you would agree with me that Mr. Boyd threatened to kill officers approximately 19 times?
Probably. Many times, yes.
Now, during your review of the taser camera videos and the audio recordings that were made while the officers were talking to Mr. Boyd, while they were negotiating with Mr. Boyd, you would agree with me that there were no officers who directed foul language to Mr. Boyd?
Not that I recall.
Okay. You would agree with me that none of the officers who negotiated or spoke with him did so in a harsh or abusive manner?
Not that I recall.
You would agree with me that all the officers who negotiated and talked to Mr. Boyd refrained from being sarcastic or demeaning in any way?
There is at least one instance that I recall where there was a flippant statement or an act of sarcasm.
Okay. Just one?
That I recall.
Okay. But for the most part, you would agree with me that the officers, when they interacted with Mr. Boyd, behaved and said things in a professional way?
Yes.
You would agree with me that the officers and the way that they spoke to Mr. Boyd was how you would want your own officers to negotiate with someone who's mentally ill?
Well, in part. I mean, as far as them speaking in a professional way, not the way I would want my own officers, particularly toward the end. I would want more engagement, more of a trained response as far as how that conversation went down.
But you would agree with me, at the end of the day, the officers, when they spoke to Mr. Boyd, did so in a professional, exemplary manner?
Yeah, I don't have any real issues other than, like I said, there was at least one statement where the kind of a flippant response.
Okay. Now, you would agree with me, based on your review of the evidence in this case, that at approximately 4:30, 2 open space officers were dispatched to the open space, and that was Officer Patrick Hernandez and Officer McDaniel. Is that right?
Yes.
They were both informed that to investigate a homeless camp that had been set up in the city's open space.
Yes.
Yes, and when responding to a call like that, you would agree with me that Officer Hernandez and Officer McDaniel had a duty to investigate the citizen complaint.
Yes, that's what they were there to do.
And in your review of the evidence in this case, would you agree with me that it was a violation of city ordinance for someone to camp in the open space without a permit?
I don't know. I didn't look at the ordinance.
Do you disagree that with the statement that was made in the investigation that the officers were there to investigate the violation of the city ordinance which prohibited camping in the open space without a permit?
No, I don't disagree with that.
And you would agree with me that the investigation revealed that camping without a permit is a misdemeanor crime in the city of Albuquerque?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. And you would agree with me that there is no evidence that was found during the investigation of this case that showed that Mr. Boyd had a permit to be out there?
Not to my knowledge.
And you would agree with me, and in your opinion, Mr. Boyd was violating the city ordinance which prohibited camping in an open space without a permit?
Yes, I believe so.
And so when Officer Hernandez and Officer McDaniel approached Mr. Boyd, they were justified in going to Mr. Boyd to investigate the violation of city ordinance.
Yes, I don't have any issues with what they
The
did.
officers were there to investigate, and that was lawful,
Yes.
and it was within their authority.
Yes.
Now, you would agree with me that Officer McDaniel and Officer Hernandez acted appropriately when they responded to the dispatch.
I don't have any criticism of their actions.
Now, you would agree with me that Mr. Boyd made threatening statements to Officer Hernandez and Officer McDaniel.
Yes, we've talked about that.
And you would agree with me that Mr. Boyd threatened Officer Hernandez and Officer McDaniel with a knife.
Yes, he did.
And you would agree with me that knives can be deadly weapons.
Yes.
So, if Officer Hernandez and Officer McDaniel testify that Mr. Boyd committed the crime of aggravated assault against them, would you agree with their assessment?
Yes.
And would you agree, based on your review of the evidence in this case, that the manner in which Mr. Boyd responded to the two open space officers constitutes the crime of aggravated assault against a peace officer?
Yes.
Based on your training and experience, you would agree with me that aggravated assault with a deadly weapon is an inherently violent crime.
Yes.
And you would agree with me that a law enforcement officer, whether they're in New Mexico or California, has the lawful authority to arrest someone who commits the crime of aggravated assault against a peace officer?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that a law enforcement officer has the authority to use a reasonable amount of force to take someone into custody who has committed the felony crime of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon?
Yes.
You would agree with me that Officer Hernandez and Officer McDaniel had the lawful authority to arrest Mr. Boyd for what Mr. Boyd did to them?
Yes.
Okay. And you would agree with me that the Albuquerque Police Department officers had the authority to arrest Mr. Boyd for the felony crime of aggravated assault, even though he was mentally ill?
Yes.
Now I'm turning your attention to the dispatch of the field services officers in response to Mr. Boyd. I'd like to ask you that based on your review of this case, you would agree with me that at about 5:02, the Albuquerque Police Department operator dispatched Sergeant Jason Carpenter and Officer Wetterlin. Is that right?
I don't remember the times without having the CAD in front of me. I couldn't tell you.
Okay. Now you reviewed the CAD in this particular case.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
And you know that the CAD, what the CAD does is it memorializes and provides a history of the call. Is that right?
Yes.
The city of Irvine does something similar. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
That as a radio dispatcher hears what is being said over the radio, the radio dispatcher essentially takes a history of what is being said. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, they do it in a shorthand way. They're hearing things, and as they're dispatching units, and they'll put in a very shorthand way of what's going on. So if somebody else wanted to look at the CAD in real time, they would have some idea. Yes.
Okay. And you agree with me that the CAD you reviewed in this particular case met those expectations, that a radio dispatcher who was hearing what was being said by the officers who were involved in the call was being reduced in writing to a history that another officer could read if they brought up the CAD for this call?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you would agree with me that at approximately 5:04, the Albuquerque Police Department dispatched CIT officer Michael Monet to the scene. Is that right?
I'd have to have the CAD report from you. I don't know what time it was.
And you would agree with me that the field officers, more importantly, CIT officer Michael Monet, negotiated with Mr. Boyd for approximately an hour and 10 minutes?
Yes, yes.
I'd like to ask you about Officer Monet's efforts to establish rapport with Mr. Boyd. You would agree with me that Officer Monet is a CIT officer?
Yes.
And CIT means Crisis Intervention Team Officer, is that right?
Yes.
And there are CIT officers throughout the country, is that right?
Yes.
And as you testified yesterday, that the whole idea of creating a crisis intervention team originated in Memphis, Tennessee.
Yes.
And that idea has essentially found its way into law enforcement throughout the country.
Yes.
And that the model that the Albuquerque Police Department uses is a model that you've seen used throughout the country.
Yes.
Officers are taught how to intervene in a crisis, is that right?
Yes.
Those officers aren't mental health care professionals, is that right?
That's true.
All the officers are equipped to do is to try and control a crisis situation from becoming bigger.
Yeah, their goal is to try and de-escalate, talk people into complying with what the police want them to do.
So they're not there to fix the problem, so to speak, as a mental health professional might.
Oh, no, that's not their job.
At the best, the most you can expect from an officer is to essentially de-escalate a situation.
That's the goal.
Right? And then from there, mental health professionals have to be available to provide the additional services that might be necessary to actually resolve a problem.
Right, that's not the job of the police.
Now, you would agree with me that Officer Monet tried to negotiate with Mr. Boyd.
Yes.
And you would agree with me that he tried to negotiate with him by seeking out what Mr. Boyd needed.
I didn't listen to the tape between Officer Monet and Mr. Boyd, so I can't give you details other than the fact that there was a lengthy negotiation.
If you're I guess I'm a little confused. Yet, is it true that yesterday you testified that it was improper to remove the CIT officers from a position negotiating with Mr. Boyd?
Yes.
Okay. And you said it was improper because you thought that if given more time, those CIT officers could continue negotiating with Mr. Boyd.
What I said is that was the job of a supervisor who was at the scene to make an assessment of whether or not the CIT officer was being effective. And if a particular CIT officer wasn't being effective, to bring in, and since they had another CIT officer, to use the other CIT officer.
But how would you know if the Officer Monet, CIT Officer Monet, was being effective if you never listened to the audio tape of his negotiations with Mr. Boyd?
I'm not doing an assessment of Officer Monet's whether or not he was being effective or not.
So wouldn't you agree with me that saying that it was basically improper to remove Officer Monet from negotiating with Mr. Boyd is an opinion of yours that doesn't have a factual foundation because you don't know and can't tell us whether he was actually succeeding in his negotiations or whether he had failed?
No, it's not a point of succeeding or failing. Sometimes it's just remaining at the same level. And again, as I said before, that's the job for a supervisor to make that assessment. And if indeed he was failing, that there were alternatives there to bring in other CIT officers.
How would you know if the supervisor was making the right decision and agreeing to the withdrawal if you were in no position to judge whether Officer Monet was making progress or not in his negotiations?
Well, again, it's the point of a procedure, of a system that's in place for policing. So that's what I would be surprised about and concerned about.
But you're concerned about the failure to follow procedure, even though you don't know if that procedure would result in a better outcome. Is that fair?
Well, we never know whether or not a CIT officer is going to do better than any individual officer, but what we do know is that they have better training and that there's a greater likelihood. And that's why we train officers to become CIT officers, and that's why we have policies that require them to be used.
But as you sit here today, you do not know the facts upon which to base an opinion as to whether Officer Monet was successfully negotiating with Mr. Boyd or making progress at any time.
No, I don't think there's any way of really knowing that.
And without knowing the success or lack thereof, of Officer Monet's efforts to negotiate with Mr. Boyd, wouldn't you agree that you're in no position to second-guess Sergeant Carpenter's assessment that Officer Monet was not making progress and that it made sense to essentially replace the CIT officers with other officers?
Again, I wouldn't have any problem with Sergeant Carpenter making that decision. What my concern would be is that the Albuquerque Police Department policy requires a CIT officer to conduct negotiations if available. There was Officer Niprath was available. He was there. So that would be my concern.
You would agree with me that that's speculation. You don't know, because you never took time to listen to the negotiations, whether the CIT model of crisis negotiation worked for someone like Mr. Boyd.
Objection, argument to the first part of that question, Your Honor.
No,
I'm sorry with the objection. I lost the question. Please repeat it.
Wouldn't you agree with me that if you don't know the facts and circumstances surrounding the negotiation, you're in no position to second guess the decisions that were made to end the negotiations?
No, again, as I've explained, there's a reason for why we have these types of procedures, and there's a reason why we have the police departments have policies to engage in this manner.
But the question I asked was about the factual basis. That you as an expert coming here into court without knowing how the negotiations were going, that is, how successful or unsuccessful Officer Monet was, that you can't speak as to whether the decision to pull Officer Monet, Officer Niprath, and the other field officers away from Mr. Boyd was proper.
Well, certainly I can't give you any opinion about Officer Niprath because Officer Niprath didn't negotiate. So as far as whether or not Officer Monet was being successful, we judge in policing when it comes to CIT success by making the arrest, by resolving the situation. So obviously he wasn't successful in the hour during his time he was speaking with them, but we don't set time limits, arbitrary time limits. So you continue working at a problem.
Okay. But you can't give the opinion that additional time would be helpful because you don't have the factual foundation upon which to say that further negotiations would be futile because you didn't review the underlying audio and videotapes that would have given you the factual basis upon which to give that opinion.
Objection, repetitive and asked and answered.
I don't know that he answered this, so I'm going to overrule the objection.
Well, again, I did listen to tapes that were subsequent to Officer Monet's being released, and there still was communication. As long as there's communication, there's opportunity.
So help me understand what you just testified to. Is it your opinion that even though Officer Monet was removed from negotiations, you feel comfortable with the fact that other negotiators were brought in because you could hear from the audio tapes that you did review that they were attempting to make progress with Mr. Boyd?
I think it's certainly appropriate for the officers who were there to continue to attempt to make progress and to continue to communicate. It would certainly have been better in following their procedures to use a CIT officer in order to do that, to further enhance the opportunities to resolve this situation peacefully.
You would agree with me that in your review of the written summary of what the videos and audios essentially showed, that there was evidence of how successful the negotiations were by Officer Monet?
Well, again, we judge success on resolution, so certainly there wasn't success.
I apologize if my question was a little vague. Did you read in Detective Stone's report his review of how successful Officer Monet's negotiations were with Mr. Boyd?
I read the entire report. I can't recall right now exactly what he said or what was written there.
Isn't it true that the report revealed that Officer Monet tried to provide Mr. Boyd with reassurance that the police were there to help him?
I'd have to see the report.
You don't remember what was in the report? Is that what you're saying?
I don't remember that specific part. No, I don't. You're citing it sounds like a sentence from a very long report.
Do you remember reading that Officer Monet attempted to find out what was bothering Mr. Boyd?
I recall reading that Officer Monet made efforts toward negotiations and that it went through a process. I'm not surprised by that.
You would agree with me that the report revealed that Officer Monet allowed Mr. Boyd to ventilate his feelings?
I can't recall that exact sentence. I'm not surprised by that. That would be a normal practice.
Right, that's what a CIT officer would do, right?
Yes.
Okay, so it doesn't surprise you that Officer Monet attempted to have Mr. Boyd ventilate his feelings?
No, not at all.
And you would agree with me that at no time did Officer Monet threaten Mr. Boyd with arrest or physical harm?
Not to my knowledge.
And you would agree with me that that's consistent with the Albuquerque Police Department SOP as to how CIT officers should engage when they're dealing with someone with a mental illness?
That's true.
You would agree with me that Officer Monet avoided topics that might agitate Mr. Boyd?
Again, I'd have to go through and listen to the actual tape to find out whether he avoided all those topics. I don't have any evidence that would lead me to believe that he did anything other than act in a way he was trained.
So as we sit here today, you would agree with me that you don't know of any evidence that suggests that Officer Monet talked about a topic, engaged in a conversation about a topic that made Mr. Boyd angry?
No.
You would agree that Officer Monet, based on your review of the investigation in this case, guided the conversation to topics that helped ease the situation?
Again, that's what I would expect him to do. Without reviewing the tape and having specific evidence in front of me, I couldn't tell you.
And you would agree with me that at all times Officer Monet was truthful with Mr. Boyd?
I'm not aware of any evidence where he was untruthful.
And despite these efforts, would you agree with me that Officer Monet was told by Mr. Boyd, this isn't a negotiation? That's a quote.
I believe I recall reading that.
And you would agree with me that despite Officer Monet's efforts, Mr. Boyd told him, quote, stop trying to disarm me with words?
That sounds familiar, yes.
Okay. So you would agree with me that despite using the tried and true techniques of crisis intervention team officers, that those techniques were not successful in changing the standoff that existed between the police and Mr. Boyd?
I would agree with that. Again, it's a process. So whenever you're engaged in this, I'm not surprised that somebody who has a mental illness is continuing to make threats or continuing to say things that are adverse to a resolution, but you keep pushing through.
You would agree with me that crisis intervention training helps officers succeed in dealing with individuals with mental illness?
Yes, that's the goal.
It's the goal, and you personally have seen it work.
Oh, yes.
That there are some CIT officers who have great success.
Yes.
But it all depends on whether the mentally ill person is in a position to essentially allow themselves to have their problems solved through negotiation.
At the end of the day, there are some people that you can talk to and you're not going to resolve the situation. But that's why, but that doesn't prevent us from trying.
And you would agree with me that despite being a highly skilled CIT officer, having lots of experience, having all the training, there are some folks with mental illness who a CIT officer simply can't reach.
That's true.
And that's when forced resolutions become appropriate.
They may become appropriate, and then it's the issue is how does that happen?
Now, do you recall in reviewing the investigation in this case that Sergeant Jason Carpenter asked Mr. Boyd, quote, how are we going to resolve this situation?
I don't recall a specific comment.
Do you recall Mr. Boyd saying in response, quote, I don't think we can. I think somebody's going to get hurt, killed. I don't even know.
Yeah, I seem to remember that.
Okay. You would agree with me that that simple statement made by Sergeant Carpenter was an open-ended question that tried to help Mr. Boyd see that the officers were there to help him solve whatever problems he faced.
Yes, I have no criticism of Sergeant Carpenter.
And you would agree with me by the response Mr. Boyd gave that he was not unwilling to even engage in a discussion about how to resolve the problems that Mr. Boyd faced.
At that moment, yes.
Okay. And you would agree with me that this just didn't happen once, but it happened numerous times throughout this incident.
Yes.
And despite the best efforts of the CIT officer, Officer Monet, Mr. Boyd never put down his knives.
That's true. He never surrendered.
Now, you were asked some questions about the officers who were there on the scene and some of the weapons that they have. And I wanted to make sure that I understood what your views were with regard to the response the Albuquerque Police Department sent to this incident involving Mr. Boyd. You don't have any concerns about the fact that 19 officers were deployed or sent to deal with the stand-up involving Mr. Boyd?
No.
Okay. You agree that 19 officers is not too many officers for the kind of incident involving Mr. Boyd?
I agree.
That 19 officers, sending 19 officers back when you were a SWAT team sergeant makes an awful lot of sense. Does that seem about right?
Yes.
So you would agree with me that the Albuquerque Police Department didn't send too many officers to deal with Mr. Boyd?
They did. You got, I'm sorry, somebody sneezed. You did not?
You would agree with me that the Albuquerque Police Department did not send too many officers to deal with Mr. Boyd?
I agree.
Now, do you have any concerns about the fact that each officer had a firearm?
No, no concerns.
Okay. You would agree with me that it would be unreasonable for an officer to show up to a situation in which a person is armed with a deadly weapon without a firearm?
Yes.
Okay. And you would agree with me that all those officers should bring sufficient ammunition to ensure that they were sufficiently supplied, is that right?
Sure.
Now, you would agree with me that if there were 9 officers who had rifles, that's an appropriate number of rifles to have in a situation like this?
Sure.
And that's something you would have done as a SWAT team sergeant back in Irvine.
Yeah, I certainly would have had a certain number of individuals with rifles.
And the fact that there were rifles and pistols, that is, you would have an officer who both had a pistol and a rifle, that doesn't trouble you, does it?
No.
And again, an officer can only manipulate one weapon at a time.
Right.
And it's always good to have a backup.
Well, depending on the situation. I mean, it's certainly, it's always good to have a backup. I wouldn't send every officer with a rifle. Matter of fact,
Right.
I would only send a small number of officers with rifles.
And in this case, only 9 officers had rifles.
Yes.
And you would agree that that's a reasonable response given the situation created by Mr. Boyd.
Yes.
Now, there were 7 officers who were there on the scene with tasers, handheld tasers. Does that sound about right to you?
Yes.
Do you have any concerns with the fact that 7 tasers were there?
No.
Now, there were 2 officers who had taser shotguns, is that right?
Yes.
Do you have any concerns with the fact that taser shotguns are being used by the Albuquerque Police Department?
No.
You would agree with me that the taser shotgun is reliable and it's effective?
It can be, just like a taser. I mean, these are not fail-safe tools. We have failures in them, but it's a reasonable tool that's used in law enforcement across the country.
Okay, so so you would agree with me that the use of the taser shotgun is appropriate for law enforcement officers in this country to use?
Yes.
And it's certainly appropriate for the Albuquerque Police Department to have 2 officers show up at this scene with 2 taser shotguns?
Yes.
There were 3 beanbag shotguns available to the officers in this situation?
I can't recall the numbers. I know that toward the end of the situation, they were calling for a beanbag to be brought up to the scene. But again, it's a less lethal tool, and it would be appropriate to have such a tool there.
Okay. And the fact that the 3 beanbag shotguns were available to the officers dealing with Mr. Boyd, that doesn't trouble you?
No.
Now, there were 2 police service dogs that were there on scene at the standout with Mr. Boyd, is that right?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that it was a reasonable decision by the Albuquerque Police Department to have those police service dogs there?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that having a police service dog available in case someone who is armed with an edged weapon might be threatening, that would be a reasonable response for someone like that?
Yes.
Now, if you look at the number of officers and weapons collectively or combined, you would agree with me that that number of officers and that number of weapons was appropriate for the situation posed by Mr. Boyd?
Yes.
You would agree with me the Albuquerque Police Department's show of force as opposed to its use of force during this incident was reasonable?
Yes.
I'd like to talk to you about a book, or I should say a chapter of a book that you mentioned during your direct examination. And I'd like to ask you if you recognize this book.
Yes.
What is this book?
It's a textbook called Critical Issues in Policing. I co-wrote a chapter that's contained in that text.
And what is the name of that chapter?
I believe you're referring to state-created danger. There's actually, I wrote another chapter in the same textbook, a different edition, but I believe you're referring to the state-created danger.
Now, this book, Critical Issues in Policing, is a college textbook, correct?
Yes.
And it's a book that you had intended to facilitate intellectual discussion by upper-level criminology and sociology students.
Yes.
And you intended this book to spur intellectual discussion by its college-age readers.
Yes.
Okay. Now, do you stand by the following statement made in your book? And this is a quote from your book. Police officers are called upon to resolve our society's shortcomings by arresting those who commit crime, manage those with mental illness, and resolve violent and dangerous situations. Often these situations happen in the middle of the night with little or no warning and no opportunity to develop a comprehensive plan, seek advice, or refer to a manual.
Yes.
Do you stand by that statement?
Yes, absolutely.
In your opinion, or I should say, do you agree that police officers are called upon to resolve society's shortcomings?
Yes.
Okay. Do you agree that society has made police officers the social workers of last resort?
In many ways, yes.
And you would agree with me that society has made police officers the mental health care workers of last resort?
Yes.
Now, even though police officers are not social workers or mental health care professionals, society expects that they perform these tasks.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you about another statement in your book and ask you if you still stand by this statement.
I'm going to object to the form of the question is improper impeachment and hearsay as well.
This is from your book. Police officers are on the nation's front line in dealing with non-compliant, resistive, combative, mentally ill, and violent subjects. Because these situations are almost always fluid, dynamic, and unique, there are no predetermined steps that may be applied in every case to achieve a desired result. It is impossible to prepare an officer for every imaginable field situation. Do you stand by that statement?
Oh, absolutely.
In your opinion, are police officers forced to make split-second judgments?
Depends on the situation. There are certainly situations where that's true, and then there are many situations where that's not true.
Okay. Now, the question I have, are police officers forced to make split-second judgments?
There are situations where police officers are required to make split-second judgments, yes.
And you would agree that police officers sometimes make split-second decisions in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that in those tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving circumstances, a police officer is oftentimes forced to make decisions regarding the amount of force that's necessary in a particular situation.
Depending on the circumstance, yes.
And you would agree with me that that task of trying to determine what amount of force is reasonable in a fast-moving, quickly evolving situation is a very tough job.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you about another statement in your book. And ask you if you stand by it. Although officers are generally well-trained, well-prepared, and quite capable of resolving violent confrontations in a safe and reasonable manner, mistakes are made. Confronting threats of serious or deadly injury that require immediate action differs significantly from considering theoretical sets of circumstances or situations that allow for time to gather resources for a comprehensive response.
Yes.
Do you agree that it is inappropriate to judge an officer using 20/20 hindsight?
No.
Okay. Let me ask you if you agree with this statement made in your book. This is a quote from your book. Using the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, use of force experts are very adept at identifying mistakes or negligent actions that officers could have performed differently. They will point out that officers should have retreated, used a less lethal tool like pepper spray, or waited for backup. They will suggest that the officer should have called for more officers, a supervisor, a SWAT team, a negotiator, a canine, an armored vehicle, or even a helicopter. They, meaning police use of force experts, will advocate that if officers had all their equipment or better equipment, if their weapons were holstered safely, or if their attention had been diverted, if they were neither too close nor too far, or any other mitigating factor, the situation could have been resolved peacefully. It's exactly this type of review that the Supreme Court sought to avoid, subjecting crisis decision-making that involved mistakes or simple negligence to hypercritical assessment in the calm and safety of the courtroom could be an obstruction to effective policing.
Yes.
Do you agree with what you wrote?
Yes.
Do you agree that a police procedures expert can always Monday morning quarterback just about any incident involving the police?
As I wrote in the chapter, is it possible to find hyper-technical violations? Of course.
In your role as a state's police procedures expert, you're in a position to Monday morning quarterback the decisions made by the police officers in the Boyd shooting.
I think that's what we're here to do, and that's what the jury's responsibility is to do. It's look back in hindsight and look at this and make an assessment of what happened. Yes.
I'm confused. You just said in your book that hindsight should not be used to judge the police. But now you just testified that the jury should use hindsight to determine what the police did was wrong. So I'm confused as to whether hindsight has a role in this case or whether it shouldn't.
Well, probably to help your confusion, if you continued reading the rest of the chapter would have explained and helped you to understand that confusion. Where the rest of the chapter talks about things of we're not going to take a look at mistakes or hyper-technical issues, but whether we should be taking a look at whether there's acts that amount to a reckless indifference that ignores the consequences and the dangers of a situation. So should we not be looking at hyper-technical things to nitpick an officer's actions? No, that's what the Supreme Court meant by not using 20/20 hindsight. Should we never go back and assess what police officers did and just say, you know what, they have a tough job, whatever, I'm sure they made the right decision? No, that's not the way we do it. We assess it within police departments. The chief testified to that yesterday. We issue discipline. There are court trials. We do indeed go back and look. There's no other way to do it.
So you're saying that hindsight should be used to judge the officers in this case, even though what you wrote in your college, or what's written in this college textbook by you, is that it should not be used?
No. I just explained that. I don't know how to explain it better to you. I mean, again, you've picked an introductory paragraph that leads on to other paragraphs that further explain what the thesis of the article is about.
Just know that we will cover a number of your paragraphs, and we'll see how that sort of works out for you.
Objection to the, whatever that is, Judge.
It's commentary and sustain.
Objection, yeah.
You would agree that the decision to use force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene.
Not a reasonable officer on the scene, so not one of those specific officers who are at the scene, but a reasonable officer who was put at that scene. So if Officer Jones is physically at the scene, it's not whether his reasonable judgment, but whether a reasonable police officer at that scene, knowing what that officer knew, found it to be objective.
I'd like to ask you some questions about how you understand hindsight so that we can have a discussion about how you think it plays a role in this case. You believe hindsight is appropriate in reviewing use of force cases.
I don't think there's any other way to, other than looking in hindsight. Certainly you have an incident that's already occurred, and you can only look at it in hindsight.
Do you agree that hindsight is not only clearer than perception in the moment, but also unfair to those who actually live through the moment?
It can be if you do it in a hyper-technical way. But again, there's no way of assessing the situation after it's occurred other than to use hindsight to look back at the events as they occurred.
Do you agree that reality looks much more obvious in hindsight than in foresight?
Yeah, absolutely. The reason why we give officers deference for the fact that they are in tense, rapidly evolving situations, and the court warns about hindsight, is because we recognize that it's difficult to make decisions in that environment. But that does not prevent us from going back and looking and assessing.
Do you agree that hindsight makes past events seem more predictable than was actually the case?
Yeah, absolutely. We have situations where, we're looking at it in the relative calm of a courtroom. We see what happens, and we know the end result, and the officers at the scene don't.
Have you ever heard of the term used by psychologists called hindsight bias?
I don't think I've read a journal article or something on hindsight bias. I mean, I think I could probably understand the concept of that, but no.
Would you agree that the term hindsight bias, that hindsight bias exists when people believe that an event is more predictable after it becomes known than it was before the event actually occurred?
I think it's certainly possible that somebody could apply a bias when looking in hindsight, but that's why you look at all the facts, and you look at the facts from the perspective of what the officers who were actually on the scene, what they actually knew.
So it's fair to say you cannot hold an officer accountable for what happens next, especially if they could not predict what was going to happen next.
No, I don't think that's a fair statement.
You think officers can look into the future and know what's going to happen?
No, of course not. But again, they have training and experience that prepares them for what may happen next. And that's why we train police officers, and that's why we train them in tactics, and that's why we gave them policies and procedures to eliminate risks that may happen next, because we don't know what's going to happen next.
But the best training can't equip an officer with the knowledge of what's going to happen in the future.
No, of course not. I can't tell you exactly what's going to happen in the future. We can't teach our officers for it. And that's part of one of the paragraphs you read, is that there's no way to train officers for every possible situation that they would face, because we couldn't even dream them up.
So it's fair to say that if you can't hold an officer for knowing what's going to happen in the future, doesn't it make sense to prevent hindsight from infecting the analysis of what the officer knows going forward?
No, again, the only way, to ignore hindsight would be to ignore any review, and that would be inappropriate.
Now, in your book, or I should say in the chapter that you wrote in this book, you reviewed a number of court opinions and decisions decided by the federal courts. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, to be clear about your background, not only were you a police officer, but you're also a lawyer.
Yes.
You graduated from an American Bar Association accredited law school.
No.
You didn't?
No. No, it didn't have, law school I went to didn't have ABA accreditation when I graduated.
Okay.
It got that afterwards.
All right. Now, in order to pass the California State Bar, you had to take a very comprehensive test. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. It was a lot of fun.
Because actually, California has the most stringent bar examination in the country. Is that true?
I've heard that. I don't know.
Okay. But certainly it was a difficult one, you would agree.
Yes.
And you are currently an attorney licensed to practice law in the state of California.
Yes.
You comply with the requirements for continuing legal education that all lawyers have to follow.
Yes.
And because you're a lawyer, you're also bound by the California Professional Rules of Ethics. Is that right?
As those ethics apply for me working as a lawyer, but since I don't work as a lawyer, I don't really focus on that.
Now, in your book, you essentially reviewed and analyzed Court of Appeals cases. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, you would agree with me, because you're a lawyer and you know how this works, that trial courts are presided over by district judges who try cases and juries that decide those cases. Is that right?
Yes.
And a federal court of appeals hears challenges to
Excuse me, Your Honor, I could object on relevance grounds and beyond the scope of direct examination.
I think I need a bench conference to further understand where we're going. So we've determined that now would be a good time to take a lunch recess. I'll give you an hour and 15 minutes today, so I'll ask that you return to the first floor jury assembly room at 1 o'clock. Thank you. Please stand for the jury. may be seated. We're actually going to be in recess, and again, just the same instruction not to discuss your testimony during recess.